to another edition of Gimmie Babel demo videos, part of the Gimmie Babel podcast with myself, David Hochbaum, and David Supakis. You can find us on iTunes and SoundCloud, Gimmie Babel, where we just talk about art, life, music, whatnot. And these videos are part of that to show in tandem some process that we might touch upon or give a little insight onto how we put some of our work together that might be helpful to you. As an artist today, I'm going to run through some basic framing. I'm going to not show you how to make frames, but pretty much show you how I make my frames, which might give a little bit insight to help you make your own work, and as a sort of template to help get an idea of how it's put together. I'm going to make pretty basic frames for small works, such as these, which are unfinished, but their size is going to stay the same, so I could start making their frames now. And the finished work will look pretty much like this. Very basic, straight up frames with a little bit of detail work, and show you how I do my backing, and you know, that's hopefully going to help you get together some frames for yourself. Now, first thing I want to start off with are some basic materials I'm going to use here, and that is, the wood is pine, which is a fairly cheap, durable wood. It's a bit knotty, usually. It's lightweight. I like to use it because it's lightweight, but it is knotty. So when you do go buy your pine in the store, hardware store, lumber yard, whatever, and you make your frames, you want them relatively straight. You want to give it a good look, you know, sort of stare down your piece like so, and see, it's not too wobbly. Of course, there's going to be a little variation, but also look for pieces maybe with less knots in it and less moist wood, where you see the kind of weeping sap pieces. They're still pretty wet and are vulnerable to warping. So keep an eye on that, but basically get yourself some nice pieces of straight pine. These are like 1x2s, something like that. Pretty basic stuff. And that's what I'm going to use. So let's get a little bit of a close-up here, look at some of this work, and then go over some of the tools you're going to need to get it done. To give you a better look here at the finished piece, what I'm going for are miter cut corners, and very simple stain, very simple trim, which helps hold the piece in place, and the backing is done very easily with just some simple screws popping in place, some wire, and some D-rings for attaching the wire to. So it's very minimal amount of stuff you need to get it done, and fairly cheap. So if you're doing multiples, which I tend to do multiple frames, as you can see, for several pieces, it's not going to break the bank, making my work ready for display. And the fun part is that you can choose your stains and colors and treatments of the wood to your own liking. And I'm gonna run through some pretty basic staining, but you could do as you wish. All right, next step. Okay, so the first step I go through to making these small frames is get the materials I need, which is the piece to frame, a pencil, pieces of pine for my frame, and for cutting I have a pair of safety glasses and earplugs, because safety first, and I can't encourage you enough. One other thing you want to have is an entire pint of coffee before you do this, so that you're as jittery and nervous as possible. Okay, when you're sufficiently freaking out, it's time to begin making your frame. So the first thing I do, without using a tape measure, I sort of just estimate the size the frame needs to be for the piece to fit inside, because it is going to be resting. I'm going to put a lip along the edge, inner edge here, so it'll just rest inside. So I can actually make it just a little bit bigger. So I make a mark. That's how big it needs to be, and I always put an X just to remind myself that this is my good piece, this is my piece to be discarded. And since this side and the bottom should be about the same, I just do this 2 times and I have that. I do the same thing with the sides. So wood I use as my measuring tool. I'd rather have the frame be a little bit too big. That's right there. That's an X, that's a 2 times. And now you've got the measurements for the wood all sorted out. The next step is to head to the beast and get them cut. Okay, here we are at a miter. It's about to get pretty loud. Put your eyeglasses on and your earplugs in. The first 4 cuts are just going to be straight cuts, very basic. Please always pay attention. I got a little bit of pencil line left. That's fine. It's pretty minimal, and some of it's going to come off when I do my miter cuts anyway, so that's okay. Okay, let's get the second one. Got my 4 ready to go. Now we're going to hit them with a miter. This is where a power saw comes in handy because it's much more accurate than hand saw without all the jiggling that goes on when you're cutting by hand. Stage left. Watch your right side, because when that blade comes down on this little piece, it sometimes wants to shoot it into outer space. After I made you 4 cuts, just to make sure that the sides and the top and bottom are all the same length, sort of check them up against each other. These are pretty even. These are pretty even. All right, this next part where I put the frame together is where certain things can be swapped out for materials that you have. I'm going to show you how I do it with the materials I use. For instance, I'm going to use screws. You could use nails. You could use just glue. You could use clamps. You could do it by hand. It's really up to what you have available to you. Okay, so one of the most indispensable tools that I use for framing are these framing clamps. They're very cheap, and you mount them on some blocks to help elevate them on the surface. Makes it much easier to work with. Highly recommend you pick yourself up 4 of these if you're going to be building a lot of frames. It's going to make it a lot easier. Alright, when doing these frames, first thing I like to do is match up the pieces that get put together, make sure they fit nice, they look nice, feel nice. I give the edges, get rid of a little bit of this frayed edges because it makes it easier to see when lining it up. You'll see also some of these parts of the frame are nicked from the blade. That's all fine for my purposes because it winds up getting sanded down once it's all done anyway. You need to have wood glue. Give yourself a little bit of a splodge there. Spread it out so it's nice and even across the surface and there's no pockets of unglued wood. Beautiful little thing. Lock it in there. For me, I like to match up the inside more than the outside because the outside, if it's a little bit off the edge, a little sandpaper will deal with that later. So I'm going to do the same thing on this side. Get rid of this frayed edge. Okay, so once you got all your edges glued together, you're ready to put in some bracing screws or nails. So first thing you want to do is make a pilot hole. Got that marked there in that position, this way that when the piece is hanging on the wall, the hole won't be seen. It's a little nicer looking. Purely aesthetic reasons. You know, it's up to you. Make a pilot hole. Another very essential tool of mine is the countersink bit for your drill. It gives you a little hole that you could drop your screw down below. Put that in nice and slow, not too fast, otherwise you could just disalign your whole frame while screwing it too tight. So go easy. Now with this countersink, you could take something like some wood filler, scoop it up with your finger, slop it in there, give it a nice amount. So it's a little bit mound over the hole. Let that dry, and then you can sand that off. You got a nice smooth edge. Doesn't completely hide the fact that you have a screw, but it does add a nice touch. I'll show you here with this finished piece where it has been sanded down and then stained over. Makes for a nice little aesthetic touch. I like it. Once again, up to you. So now after every corner is glued and braced, I can release it from the clamps. You could set to dry for a few hours, or you could release it right away. And what I like to do is take some more of this wood filler in any of these sort of gaps along the miters and corners. Really rub it in there. In a couple hours, this thing will be ready to sand down. You'll have a nice, smooth, cornered frame, minimal gaps. And when you stain it, depending on what you use, if you use natural stains, you'll be able to see some of these marks. I like the way it looks. You could use more opaque stains and completely hide it if you want. Your call. Okay, so essentially by this point, I basically showed you how to make a box. Now, next step is going to show you how to elevate this box into what could be a nice little frame for your work. For this, I am going to use for trim these small pieces of dowels. These are square dowels, which you can pick up at most art supply shops, hobby shops. Look online and you can find different sizes and shapes of dowels. I'm using these square black. They're pretty much all standard size, coded by color. These are black, and I believe that the material is walnut. It's a little bit stronger than pine, and it adds a little bit of a different tint, so when staining it's going to stand out a little bit more. If that's something you don't want, use the same kind of wood or use an opaque stain. For measuring these pieces, I essentially use a similar technique as I do for measuring the frame wood. This is my bottom and top. For the bottom, I just line it up there, give it a mark, and this is where I cut. Now, I do not use a miter saw for such a small piece of wood. You could use a hand miter, that would be fine. I use these cutters, which are pretty much made for cutting wood like this for hobby enthusiasts and whatnot. It makes it much easier. Check it out, make sure you get it the right size. And that's pretty much what I'm looking to get. Sure, I always cut a little above the line because it's easier to take away than add on. Now you got your trim all cut and ready to attach. So let's do that. For attaching the trim, there are two things I like to use: glue and clamps.
I got 96 tears and 96 eyes.
These guys, not always the best tool for the job because the amount of pressure that they wind up putting on the wood can make an impression on the wood. It's good to have these little plastic guys, even though sometimes annoying, they're very handy. This particular frame, since it's going to get sanded down, tiny indentations will be eliminated with a sander. More delicate jobs, I suggest using these sort of clamps. You can adjust the amount of pressure you want. These guys, as you can see, you don't get any say how much pressure they put. Okie dokie. I start with the top and the bottom. A bit of a sloppy worker. Wind up getting glue everywhere. You adjust it to how you like. So you go all around 4 sides. I usually do the 2, let it dry, do the next 2, let it dry, and then it's ready for some sanding and beautifying. Come. Hi, it's a whole new day and we got our frame drying overnight. So let's unclamp it and see what we got. Yes?